Hello everyone, welcome to our audiobook channel. If you enjoy this story or want to hear more exciting content, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Your feedback helps us improve and bring even more captivating stories. Enjoy listening. Dark Journey, Secrets and Nightmares on the Streets of Santiago is a book about a man's pilgrimage that becomes his darkest nightmare as secrets emerge and ghosts haunt his path. A woman has disappeared on the Camino de Santiago, the ancient 500-mile pilgrimage across northern Spain. Daniel, an Irish expatriate, walks the lonely path carrying the ashes of his wife Petra, along with the horrifying secret of how she really died. When he teams up with sporty California girl Ginny to walk, she seems like the perfect antidote to his grieving heart. But a nightmarish spectre begins to stalk them, and his mind begins to shatter with the horror of things he cannot explain. Unexpected twists and turns echo on the ancient trail they traverse. The lines begin to blur between reality and insanity, between the truth and the lies we tell ourselves. Chapter 1. Alto del Perdón. The sea is missing. Daniel stands tall in the early morning on the soaring ridge of Alto del Perdón, searching for a phantom ocean. All he can make out are a patchwork of farmers' fields. They hover in and out like a mirage beneath the thinning mist settled in the valley below. His navy nylon jacket snaps and billows in the stiff breeze of the exposed hillside. Half a dozen towering wind turbines emit low moans as their massive metal blades turn steadily behind him. At the base of one is a boldly colored framed backpack, lying open where Daniel has left it at the side of the trail. In his hands he holds a small burlap bag with Petra inside. A long line of rusty cut-out men and women are positioned sentinel-like on the ridge, a flat metal monument to all those who, over the centuries, have walked the Camino de Santiago, the 500-mile pilgrimage they call the Way. Daniel watches as the silhouettes of the heavy sculpture shudder with the force of the wind. He takes a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. The scent is all wrong to him. Unnatural, without a taste of seawater in it. The rocky outcrops and high altitude, the mist below, they all trick him into thinking he is back in Ireland on the coast of Kerry, where he spent summers as a child by the sea. He and his sister had explored the rugged cliffs above the shoreline for hours, standing far out on the ledges, daring each other. "Stop being idiots," his father would bellow from the safety of a lawn chair under the awning of their parked caravan. And Daniel and Angela would trudge back from the sweet seduction of certain death, utterly defeated. Their two older brothers would have deserted them earlier, having the sense to commit the risk-taking out of sight of a parent. Maybe he and Angela were idiots after all. Ever since his first day walking the Camino, climbing through the pass of the French Pyrenees to the Spanish border, Daniel has expected to look down and see the swell of whitecaps, to drink in the tang of brine. The Pyrenees were almost 50 miles ago now, but he still feels the want of salt in the air. He switches the rough brown bag containing Petra to one hand and pulls a stash of sodium-laden beef jerky from his pocket. As if to compensate, he takes a furious bite. He is less than a week into his pilgrimage through northern Spain, hiking from Saint-Jean-Pied-Port at the border in France to the cathedral in Santiago that houses the shrine of Saint James. The full journey will take him over a month to complete. He travels alongside other pilgrims of varying nationalities and spiritual intent, mostly keeping to himself. Each night after a full day of walking, he checks in at a local albergue. These are modest pilgrim hostels where 5 to 15 euros will get you anything from the top bunk at a large modern municipal to a hard stone floor of a 13th century monastery. The austerity appeals to his sense of simplicity, or maybe he's just cheap. Sure, no one really believes the bones of St. James are buried there at Santiago, his sister, Angela, had told him before he left. Not even the Catholic Church. Perhaps, he said, as he looked down at the map of Spain on the coffee table of his living room, the lap perched next to it on a stack of books as he Skyped his sister from his home in the States. Even so, he had traced one finger along the lonely red-dotted line of the Camino, wondering what he might find at the end of it. One of the turbines groans more loudly, hitting some temporary mechanical resistance. The labored breath of the sound makes him uneasy. He stuffs the beef jerky back in his pocket. 50% of Spain's energy comes from the wind, he reminds himself. Read it in the guidebook. This is the kind of interesting but ultimately useless fact that seems to always lodge in his brain, like a piece of popcorn caught in the teeth, and at times just as annoying. Mostly for other people. Guess what the longest street in the world is, he had once asked his eldest brother as he sat with him on the tractor. Daniel had still been far too young to drive it. The one where I have to listen to your mouth yapping all day. The rough burlap bag has a drawstring at the top. Daniel rubs the little braided ropes with his thumb. There is a crinkle inside the coarse material. Plastic. He hadn't wanted the ashes to get wet if it rained. His backpack was supposed to be waterproof, but he needed to be sure. Petra would have laughed at his practicality. Always the engineer, planning for contingencies, she would say. He cannot believe he has put his wife in a Ziploc bag as if she were a ham sandwich or a dime of weed. He glances over at the two-dimensional metal figures bent over with their walking staffs and donkeys, medieval pilgrims without the benefit of ergonomically correct backpacks and thermalite hiking boots from the outdoor store. Daniel had bought an old-style pilgrim staff at one of the tourist shops back in France before he started on the Camino. It had a carved wooden handle and made him look like a prat. He abandoned it in a coffee shop in Zubiri, deciding he could make it to the Cathedral of St. James in Santiago without something to lean on. The heavy sculpture shudders again. The vibration makes a howling sound, and Daniel feels a tremor echo in his own body. If his granny were here, she'd say a goose just walked over his grave. The old woman had many sayings. Some were old Irish, some she just made up. These are the words of your ancestors, Daniel, she would intone, trying to make him pay mind. The land he grew up on had been farmed by Kennedys for almost 500 years. He couldn't have escaped his ancestors if he tried. Trying to shake off the feeling, he shifts from one leg to the other. His new hiking boots feel strange without the steel toe that he normally wears at home when inspecting a job, the familiar density reassuring his foot. Not that he's been on a job site in a while. As their construction business in New Jersey grew, Daniel and his partner, Gerald, found themselves tied more and more to the office. But of course, he's all set to sell his half of the firm, or just about. They'd had an offer from a group in New York that would be hard to turn down. There are still papers to sign that Gerald keeps worrying him about. Once that's done, Daniel's expected to come back home to Ireland and take over the farm. His father is ready to retire to his lawn chair permanently. Nothing is keeping Daniel in New Jersey anymore, now that Petra is gone. Had gone to the States for her and never regretted it, even though he had always felt the pull of the land he grew up on. Those bloody ancestors again. Petra, a child of the North American melting pot, did not have the same ties. Her folks had died in a car crash during her senior year at college. She had no siblings, but her roots were in America just the same, and he had made a life with her there. Daniel has come to the Camino to spread Petra's ashes. This is what he needs to do before he can go back to Ireland. This is what he has told his sister, his parents. This is what he has told himself, so he can move on, as everyone keeps telling him he must do. He and Petra had always planned to walk the Camino together, ever since they saw the golden scallop shells and arrows pointing toward the Spanish pilgrimage from France on their honeymoon. He feels that bringing her ashes here serves to keep a promise, although so many promises remain unfulfilled when someone leaves before you're ready, like a dinner guest who gets up and walks out during the main course. He could spend a lifetime trying to finish the meal that should have been a future shared with his wife, and the food would rot on the dishes anyway. Somehow he just can't bring himself to take away her plate. It's been over a year now since Petra died, and he hasn't even put their house in Paterson on the market yet. "When are you coming home?" Daniel, his sister, Angela, had asked during one of her weekly phone calls from her apartment in Dublin. His parents were still on the farm at Carn en Attire in Kilmeady, but she made the drive out every other weekend to check on them. They were all getting anxious. If Daniel didn't come home, his father would have to sell out. All those ancestors to be owned by somebody else. His granny would reach out and cuff him from the grave at the sheer shame of it. "I've got some things to do," he said. He always had reasons. First it was the winding up of the business with his partner. Then it was critical home renovations he needed to make before he could sell. As those jobs dried up, he created new ones, increasingly more futile. After putting a bidet in the guest bathroom, he told Angela, "Correct me if I'm wrong, but how many people when they come over for a cup of tea are looking to wash their genitals?" Of course, she had a point. He had ignored it though. The Camino is his latest effort at procrastination, having run out of rooms to renovate in the house where he and Petra had lived since they were married over 10 years ago. Happy years for the most part, until the cancer twisted her into someone he could barely recognize. As gnarled and rake-thin as the carved wooden staff he had left behind in the coffee shop. Petra wouldn't have liked that comparison. She hadn't been a vain woman, but shed had her pride. She said the worst part of cancer was turning into something alien, like the dwarfed extraterrestrial in the movie E.T. All she needed to do was hide in a closet full of pinch-faced stuffed animals, she teased the doctors, and they would never find her. Daniel had brought Reese's pieces for her the next day in the hospital to continue the joke. She had coughed her version of laughing in those final weeks. He should do it here. It makes sense to let the ashes float from the cradle of his hands down into the disappointingly landlocked valley below, an offering to everything he can't accept, like having an ultrasound diagnose uterine cancer instead of the baby he and Petra had hoped for, a ruthless surprise that had spread through her body like hot gossip. He'd be angry at God, but he has enough Irish Catholic superstition to believe it might land him in hell or on the receiving end of a lightning bolt. He looks with distrust at the metal pilgrims beside him, then scans the sky for storm clouds, on the off chance. "What do I need with a uterus?" Petra had said. "It's not a vital organ. Nothing will change." But the things that became vital after that changed them both. Daniel continues to stand looking out on the valley, almost as motionless as the rusty pilgrims on the ridge. The burlap bag remains closed in his hands, its contents secure. Daniel's right thumb draws the string a little tighter. When he hears the voice from behind him, he jumps as if he has just stuck a wet finger into a light socket. "I'd stand up and if I were you." He whips around, holding the burlap bag protectively behind his back, looking ridiculous, like a kid trying to hide a porn magazine from his mother. A stunted copse of trees grows on the west side of the wind turbines. Someone, a woman, judging by shape, sits alone on a rock there, partly obscured by branches and morning mist. Beside her is one of those cairns you see on the way, built from small stones the pilgrims leave behind, called intentions, small rock embodiments of their prayers and purposes. The cairns make Daniel twitch. In Ireland they used to mark a place of death, like a car accident, and he can't help but cross himself every time he sees one. The woman sits there with her face turned away, not acknowledging him. "Pardon me," he says, annoyed now that she rattled him so. He starts walking toward her, the bag still in his hands. She remains turned in profile. Her features seem to morph with the mist and then solidify as he approaches. He stops, confused by the phenomenon. The clearer she becomes, the more everything around them starts to fade. He no longer hears the wind or the turbines. No longer feels the roughness of the burlap bag in his hand. All he can process is the one sense, the sight of her. All he can see is the rich hair tumbling down her back in long waves, natural and free, worn just the way he had always liked. He reaches toward her involuntarily. His fingertips still remember the feel of those rich strands slipping gently through his hands. Petra, he takes a few tentative steps closer. His other senses have returned. He can smell her coconut shampoo now. The woman doesn't move. He still can't see her face, but in her lap her hands are clasped together, a shadowy tube slithering out from the back of her right one. The ever-present Roman 4. "Petra, is that you?" he whispers, not believing. The woman doesn't answer. Her long hair trembles in the wind. Daniel begins running toward her. She turns her head at the sound of his heavy footfalls, then jumps up from the rock and knocks over the cairn. She stumbles and falls on her ass as the intentions spill out all over the ground. "What the hell?" she yells at him. He looks at the woman sprawled in the dirt. Her hair is no longer running free down her back in waves, but tied in a high ponytail beneath a pink ball cap. The white stitching on it reads, "Kiss me, I'm smart." She juts out her lower lip and blows a piece of hair out of her eyes, the result of overgrown bangs. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" the woman says as she gets up and brushes gravel off the seat of her hiking pants. "You scared the shit out of me." He sees the tube now. It hangs not from the back of her hand, but from the hydration bladder in her backpack. Her hair is honey brown, not pale blonde like Petra's. Her face doesn't even remotely resemble Petra's, though her body is toned and fit as Petra's had been before she got sick. How could he have mistaken her for Petra? He needs to get a grip. Start wearing his hat more often in the full sun. "If you plan to attack me, I suggest you get it over with," she tells him as she zips up the front of her jacket. She reaches for her backpack, which he notices is the smaller framed duplicate of his own, right down to the color, bright turquoise. He had wanted black, but the girl at the outdoor store had ordered the wrong one, and it had been too late to make an exchange. He had tried to roll it in the mud a few times to make it look manlier, then felt like a git for doing so. His sister had told him he should be too evolved to feel emasculated by a color. "What I mean, no." Daniel watches her pull the hip belt of the pack tight around her middle, adjust the load lifters on both sides. "I thought," he pauses, "I thought you were after saying something." He's not sure of anything now. Maybe she hadn't said anything. Maybe he had just run at a woman alone in a secluded spot for no reason. The Camino was usually safe, but there had been incidents lately. No wonder she'd shouted at him. "I said I'd stand upwind if I were you," she says, looking down as she snaps the sternum strap across her chest into place. He wasn't completely mad then. He had heard her speak after all. And why might that be? Daniel asks. She has managed to annoy him again, despite the fact he's still shaking. "So the ashes don't blow back on you in the wind," she says, coming toward him, her thumbs hooked in her shoulder straps, standing impossibly close. He can see the faded sprinkle of freckles along the bridge of her nose, smell the dried, overripe fruit of a power bar on her breath. "I saw it happen to a guy earlier. He ended up with his son all over his rain pants." And with that, she walks away from him, making her way down the ridge, her backpack with the attached white scallop shell bouncing with the sway of her hips. It was an enduring symbol of the way, that shell, representing one of St. James' many miracles. Daniel hadn't attached one to his own pack, though most did. He had never been good with outward symbols, preferring to play his cards and his purposes close. He watches the woman slowly sink out of sight, hiking down the other side of the peak. The wind blows his curly black hair into his face when he turns back to look at the valley. She was right about the risk of getting Petra caught in an updraft. This isn't the right place for her. Daniel goes back to get his pack, placing the burlap bag carefully inside. He buries it deep at the bottom beneath his guidebook and passport. Then he pulls out the broad-brimmed hat he wouldn't be caught wearing anywhere else and pulls it down over his unruly wind-blown hair. When he stands, he lifts the pack onto his shoulders and feels the weight settle into the strength of his back. But he still carries the heavy doubt of the sea in his mind, just as he carries what's left of his wife, unable to accept what happened to her any more than the scent in the air. He wonders whether 500 miles will be enough to finally lay her to rest when he was the one who killed her. The towering wind turbines turn, stoic against a harsh sky, as he follows the path where he has just watched the woman who is not Petra disappear. The stones on the way down from Alto del Perdon are slippery with the rain from yesterday. Daniel takes his time picking his way along the trail. He can't afford to twist an ankle, not when he still has weeks of walking to go. Banked on either side of him are stunted grass and low brush. The occasional huge boulder sits marooned at the side of the trail, as if washed up on the shore of his imagined sea. Gravity rams his toes into the front of his boots. Maybe it is a good thing there is no steel in them. He is surprised when he comes around a bend and finds her waiting for him, a curious look on her face, somewhere between amusement and wariness. "You're different," she says, leaning against one of the boulders. It is a statement with a hint of a question. How Daniel asks her. He stops, braces himself sideways on the hill. "Just different." The accent, he says, guessing. Daniel's accustomed to being outed by the sound of his voice. Most people know as soon as he opens his mouth where he's from, although there was a lanky American a few days ago that had thought he was English. That and the fact that the guy never shut up made him want to punch him in his skinny gut. "Maybe," she says. Her accent betrays her as well. She is also American. "I thought maybe you were from around here at first." Daniel's granny had always said he had the look of the Spaniard, an Irish pronouncement reserved for those with dark and not obtrusted attractiveness. "The Spanish Armada did some marauding in my country a few hundred years ago," he tells her. "Left a fair amount of their gene pool about." She waits a while before answering, as if weighing the pros and cons of marauding gene pools. "Mind if I walk with you?" she says, apparently deciding in favor of his DNA. "Free country," Daniel replies. He's still a little pissed about how she caught him off guard before, but then again, she did save him from wearing Petra on his jacket. "My name's Virginia," she says, holding out one gloved hand. "People call me Jenny." Daniel," he says, stepping toward her to return the handshake. He can feel the coldness of her fingers through the thin wool. He forces a smile. Then, not knowing quite what to do next, he starts back down the hill. "Who you got in the bag, Daniel?" she asks, falling in behind him. "None of your feckin' business. That's who I got in the bag." That's a bit harsh. Realizing it probably was, he tries a peace offering. "Beef jerky?" he asks, holding out the redandback cellophane bag. "No, thanks." He puts the hard-cured meat back in his pocket. When he pulls out his hand again, he rubs it together with the other one, blowing on them. He's got gloves in his backpack, but he doesn't bother with them despite the warmth of the autumn sun not yet reaching this side of the valley. He started early this morning while everyone else was still asleep at the albergue, not being a fan of crowds. A result of a rural upbringing with an abundance of space. Also, he's a bit of an ass before his first cup of coffee. For that reason, it is probably a good thing they don't talk all the way down. He walks silently, knowing she is behind him. He can hear her ponytail swishing back and forth on the nylon shoulders of her jacket. He remembers the hair he thought he saw flowing down her back up on the ridge, pale and almost to her waist. Wishful thinking is a powerful hallucinogen, he decides. Soon the topography begins to change, becoming more and more level, fewer rocks, more gravel. The mist is receding with the day. When they round a final bend, the Camino lies in front of them like a length of grey ribbon undulating through plucked orchards and farm fields burnt brown from a summer of hot Spanish sun. They stop for a moment and take in the new scenery, but not for long. There are still 8 miles to go to the next albergue, where Daniel plans to spend the night. He's in good shape, but that doesn't mean walking 6 hours a day doesn't make him feel like an old man by evening. He is nervous at first as they switch to walk beside one another. There is something more personal in this than traveling single file. In time, however, he relaxes into the hypnotic beat of the trail, uninterrupted by speech. Their steps strike a hollow rhythm on the tightly packed earth, gravel kicked up by their hiking boots the only variation in tempo. He builds up the courage to steal a glimpse of her. Just a few seconds. He takes in the determined set of her jaw in contrast to the full lips. The little divot on the outside of one slender nostril, betraying the small wildness of a former piercing thought better of. All contrasted with the serious deep-set hazel eyes she had fixed him with back up on the ridge when she had chastised him for frightening her. Ginny said he was different, but he senses she is too. A woman of contradictions. When she catches him staring, he turns away, embarrassed. Great. Now she'll think he's a pervert. I'm sorry for asking you about the ashes, she says. No mind, Daniel tells her. I reckon I'm just a bit sensitive about it. Just a bit. She pauses. Is that why you came on the Camino? I suppose so. Everyone has a story, she says with a look of understanding. She's right. Everyone Daniel has met on the Camino seemed to come with a history. He had met a German guy whose daughter had committed suicide. He carried ashes as well. Then there was the middle-aged woman he'd walked with for an afternoon whose husband had left her after 30 years of marriage. She had financed her trip by selling off his favorite football card on eBay. Why did you come, he asks, getting the nerve up to turn and look at her again. To pick up guys, she says. She bursts out laughing when his face starts to redden. He turns away again and keeps walking. Great, he thinks. I'm walking the Camino with a fecking comedian. When they enter the first small village, the two still haven't spoken again. It's not due to any ill will, more because each has sensed the other needed some quiet time. There are two vital things a pilgrim needs to learn on the Camino. One is how to prevent blisters and the other is when to shut up. But when they pass a noisy bar full of pilgrims eating breakfast, Daniel breaks the silence to tell her he needs to get a coffee. She waits outside for him. When he comes back outside with his steaming styrofoam cup, the street is empty. He looks up and down the road but can't find her. Then she speaks from behind him and scares the shite out of him for a second time. Where the hell did she come from? You notice they are all bars here, she says. Daniel wipes his hand where he spilled a bit of the hot liquid on it when she startled him. The canteens, you mean? He takes a deep sip of the caf con leche, steadying himself. Feckin' heaven. I have. Saw two fellas yesterday knocking back shots at 7 in the morning with their tea and croissant. I've seen the same thing. They're always so serious though. Like alcoholism is a job they had to show up for when they'd rather stay in bed. You got to admire their work ethic, he says, taking another sip. This time when she laughs, he smiles instead of blushing. The two follow the yellow arrows and scallop shells that take them through the small village and keep them on the Camino. Some of the signs and symbols are painted roughly on the walls of old stone buildings. Some are built into the pavement beneath their feet. They meander through village streets and alleyways on a route used by pilgrims for over a millennium. It leads not just to the cathedral in Santiago but past most of the churches within walking distance. Daniel can see the belfry of one coming up on the right. When he looks up, he can make out a huge nest perched precariously on the top. Every church in Spain seemed to have at least one resident stork. Daniel watches to see if the bird is roosting as he walks by, but the nest is abandoned. If there are any eggs, they have been left unattended. Why do you think they brought babies? His response to her question is inelegant but authentic. Babies are the last thing on his mind despite his concern for the eggs. Why do you think they always said that the storks brought the babies, she explains, pointing at the nest. They were there, he says, musing. It's always easiest to put the blame on whatever's close at hand. Her eyes flash approval. I suppose it is. Although not necessarily fair. Life isn't fair, Daniel says, and then regrets it. What a downer he is. He tries to recover from looking like a depressing git, even though for the last year he has probably been one. Did your parent blame the storks? My mother gave me a detailed explanation at the age of 4, complete with a discussion of the missionary position and a picture book with fallopian tubes. Impressive, Daniel says, and he means it. I forgot it all by the time I was 6 and had to have it explained again. Did you remember it after that, he asks her. I can still sketch a vast difference from memory, she tells him, smiling. God, that smile. Playful but challenging. It could set a man off his balance. What did your parents tell you about where babies came from, she asks. Nothing, Daniel tells her, fiddling with the straps of his pack. How could your parents tell you nothing, she asks, pressing him. I asked my mother that once, he says, remembering the conversation. He was a grown man by then. She told me you grew up on a farm, Daniel, with the bull let loose on the poor cows in the field each spring. You'd think a clever chaser like yourself might figure a thing or two out. He plays up his mother's Irish accent. She was from the town and had a different dialect than the rest of them. And did you figure it out, Ginny asks him, completely deadpan. I suppose, he says. But from my experience, I do say women are a fair bit different from cows. She stares at him now, and he wonders if he has gone too far comparing women to livestock and mimicking his mother with an exaggerated accent like a stock Irish moron. He really needs to get out more. She continues to fix him with those penetrating grey-green eyes. For a moment, the pupils seem to widen, swallowing up each iris entirely. The wide black circles make him take a step back. Then she's smiling again, and the healthy hazel returns, the earlier absence of color a trick of the light. Are you interested in a side trip, Daniel, she says with a raised brow above a perfectly normal eye. He nods dumbly, then recovers. Where to? The site of a massacre, she says. It'll be more interesting than cows. Chapter 2. Utagatuobanos. The side trail at Murosville only adds a couple of miles to Daniel's planned route. It is not every day you get to see a building associated with the Knights Templar. The Church of Santa Maria de Unate is 12th century Romanesque and octagon-shaped, a miniature of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem it was modelled on. The ruins of its external cloister surround the small chapel with crumbling columns and archways. According to the guidebook, the name translates to Saint Mary of 100 Doors. Daniel counts 33 as he approaches. Being Irish, he's not too offended by the exaggeration. He wants to tell Ginny all this but doesn't want to bore her with his need to spew facts. Instead, he keeps the knowledge to himself. This effort requires a force of will that almost brings the coffee back up his throat. Although there is a large parking lot in front for tourists, the place looks empty. This is the off-season, and the building looks gloomy and abandoned. It rests at the base of a series of rolling foothills. So, where's the massacre, he asks Ginny as they cross the main road to the parking lot. You know, Friday the 13th, she says, not bothering to look both ways as they cross the highway. The date or the horror movie, he asks her. The date, she says. It was the day the Knights Templar were wiped out by the Catholic Church in a bloody mass execution. Is that why it's considered unlucky? Sure was unlucky for the Knights, she says. It is not lost on him that she appears to share his enthusiasm for random facts. He wonders if she knows what the longest street in the world is. They were the financial arm of the church, of course. Yes, she says, nodding, pleased. Their castles and churches used to be all along the Camino, a place of refuge for the medieval pilgrims starving half the time and sick, or injured from attacks by roving bands of thieves. She does a sweep of the parking lot with her eyes as if roving thieves may still be an issue, then pushes a stray hair from her ponytail behind one ear. But the money the Templars held made them too powerful. The Pope had to get rid of them. Is that who is buried in the cemetery there, the massacred knights? Daniel points at the small graveyard on the west side of the church just now coming into view. No, she says. Who'd be buried there, then, he asks. The pilgrims who didn't make it. As they approach, they see the site is not entirely deserted. Sitting on a low stone wall between the graveyard and the church is a lone pilgrim. He is dressed much like they are, convertible hiking pants, warm fleece and jacket, and a painter's cap to keep off the sun. He sports a beard as most men do on the Camino, shaving being one of the first daily grooming habits to go. This man's red-brown beard is better kept than Daniel's. He probably had it before he came. The man lifts his arm and waves at them in greeting. His lengthy legs jut out in front of him, one well-worn hiking boot crossed over the other. Hola, buen camino, he calls out as they get closer. Buen camino, both Ginny and Daniel respond, but it is Ginny who continues. ¿Está abierto? She asks him. No hablo español, the man tells her. Soy Hollands. Dutch, she tells Daniel, and then addresses the pilgrim again. Do you speak English? Yes, he says, and smiles at her. Although not as well as German, but much better than Spanish. He has a Swiss Army knife open, slicing up a red apple. The sharp blade moves deftly in his large hands. On the stone wall he has laid out a checkered linen napkin with a large hunk of dark-skinned cheese and a crusty loaf of bread. The church will not open for another quarter hour. We must wait, he tells them. Daniel eyes the white juicy flesh of the apple. They hadn't stopped for breakfast, and it's nearly lunchtime. He tries not to visibly drool. The Dutchman gestures with an open hand to the food. Please join me, he says with a gentleman's flair. This is something Daniel has noticed about the Dutch, their graceful thoughtfulness. It is a stereotype that becomes the Netherlands, much like tulips. Thanks, but we wouldn't want to be disturbing your meal, Daniel says, now eyeing the fresh rind of the cheese as well as the apple. He doesn't want to take the man's lunch, although he probably shouldn't have answered on Ginny's behalf. She doesn't appear to have noticed, though, as she sits down and tears a good-sized piece of bread from the loaf and pops it into her mouth. This is great, she tells the Dutchman, taking off her gloves. Very civilized. The Dutchman spears a piece of apple with the knife and tips it toward her. She leans in and takes it between her teeth, the shiny blade dangerously close to her lips. Her eyes close in satisfaction. He skewers another piece and offers it to Daniel. Please, you are hungry, he says. Daniel hesitates for a second more and then takes the fruit from the knife point carefully with his fingers, popping it in his mouth. The tart juice wakes up his tongue, reminding him how thirsty as well as hungry he is. It is time for a break. Slipping off his backpack, he sits down alongside the other two pilgrims. Thank you, he says as the Dutchman cuts off a generous piece of cheese and hands it to him. Its creaminess clings to the sides of Daniel's mouth. He washes it down with a good swig from his water bottle. The Dutchman puts down the Swiss Army knife and wipes his right hand on his pants before he extends it. I am Rob, he says before adding theatrically, the most handsome and intelligent man in the Netherlands. His wry smile is infectious. Daniel shakes his hand. I am Daniel from New Jersey, he tells him through a mouthful of bread. Rob nods at him without any question in his eyes. People whose first language is not English don't usually detect the accent. Daniel enjoys the chance to be culturally ambiguous. And you, the Dutchman asks, turning to his other lunch guest. Ginny, she says. From California. Is this where you learned your Spanish? Rob asks her. Sort of, she says, cutting off a piece of cheese. I took a course before I left. Plus, you pick things up after a while. Daniel wishes he had taken a course in Spanish before he left. 2 days ago, he tried to order wine in a restaurant. Vino del Au meant young wine, he was told, the fresh kind they served for drinking early in the year. But he had pronounced it incorrectly, and the insulted waitress told him in English that he had asked for wine of my butthole. Where did you learn your English? She asks the Dutchman. Oh, from English speakers at my work. I owned once a moving business, but I had to sell and change to a new job. My heart, he says as he pounds on his chest for emphasis, was not strong enough for the stress. I am not sure in English. The Dutchman pauses for a healthy burp and to search for words. I go around for my passes, he says. A heart bypass, Ginny suggests. Yes, that is right. A heart bypass. My wife says no more stressful work after this. I listen to my wife. What do you do now? Daniel asks him. I am a miller, Rob tells him as he pulls another apple from his pack. We grind wheat for bread in the old way with a windmill. Wow, that is so Dutch, says Ginny. Rob laughs, curling his fist and holding it to his mouth so he doesn't choke on a bite of apple. It is, he admits, as he coughs. When he clears his throat, he reaches into his backpack and pulls out a short fat link of chorizo. He cuts off a slice of the spicy sausage and offers it to Ginny. No, thanks, Ginny says, chewing on a piece of bread before closing her mouth self-consciously. The chorizo is very good, Ginny, you should try it, Rob says, cutting a wedge for Daniel with his knife. That's okay, she says quietly. Are you a vegetarian? Rob asks her, a bit more perceptive than Daniel. She had refused his beef jerky twice since Alto del Perdon and he hadn't caught on. You're not a vegan, are you? Daniel says when she doesn't respond. Those people are mad. He had dated a vegan girl in college once. She had lived off fennel seeds and wheat grass. The only good thing he can remember about her is that she was biodegradable. No, not vegan. Just nothing with a face. Ginny takes a sip from a water bottle she carries. She must have it as a backup for the hydration bladder in her pack. I eat fish though, she adds. Sure, but fish have faces, Daniel says. Yeah, but they're ugly faces. This is a shame, Rob breaks in, looking serious. There are too many things to enjoy in life to only eat the ugly faces. Daniel takes another bite of chorizo, grinning. None of them hear the studded church doors open until a rough voice calls out from them. A shrunken elderly Spanish woman pokes her head out as she makes the announcement and then abruptly retreats, like a turtle pulling back into its shell. Daniel turns to the others after grabbing a last piece of apple. Ready to go in? Sure, says Ginny, standing and brushing crumbs from her lap. She doesn't put her gloves back on. It has warmed up now with the midday. Daniel takes off his hat and stuffs it in his bag. I will finish eating, Rob says, pulling another crust of bread from his backpack, picking up the last piece of cheese. I have seen it before anyway. You saw it before? Daniel asks. But it was closed. I am not good with my English. I mean, I have seen inside churches like this before. They are all the same. Ginny and Daniel walk under the main arch of the external cloister and enter through the open doors of the stone chapel. It can't be more than 30 feet across inside. At the front is a simple raised semicircular sanctuary, where a small table is laid out with a white linen cloth and the tools of the Eucharist. The silver trays of communion are each adorned with a cross. Daniel looks up to see that the ceiling is ribbed and curved like a stone basket turned upside down. Hand Gregorian chants float up from a speaker on a folding table in the corner, where the elderly Spanish woman sits guarding a stamp pad. All pilgrims have a pilgrim passport that they need to get stamped at intervals along the way to prove they are walking. Otherwise, they can't stay in the albergues, which are meant only for people who are undertaking the pilgrimage to the cathedral in Santiago. You can have your passport updated at any of the major stops or attractions. Ginny lays out her passport for the woman but is ignored. The old lady has become distracted by the speaker, trying to adjust a short in the wire that causes the chanting to cut in and out like medieval club music. She flicks a fly from her ancient sun-spotted nose as she fiddles with the connection. Ginny gives up and moves on. Daniel doesn't even bother. He only gets the obligatory stamps each night at the albergue he stays in. They both light candles at the front. There are real candles here, not the usual false electric flames in a plexiglass-lidded box that you activate with a couple of coins dropped in a metal slot. Daniel sits in one pew, Ginny in another. The Gregorian chants have been fixed and now echo again off the curved stone walls. Daniel makes the sign of the cross and lowers his head to pray. It seemed appropriate, although he doesn't make use of the kneeler, which makes him wonder at his own seriousness. Our Father can't hear you if your knees aren't screaming another of his granny's sayings. That woman was a peach. He tries hard for a few minutes, but the prayer won't come. He can't even seem to speak to Petra, as he often does at moments like these. He feels cut off from her. He's not sure whether it is because he is walking with the cute girl across the pew, or because he almost threw Petra off a cliff a few hours ago. He knows he needs a touch of the divine, but his prayers remain empty. His eyes are still closed when he feels Ginny's cool breath in his ear. She speaks with a hush. "Let's get out of here. This chanting is giving me the creeps." A smile comes easily to his lips in response, despite the somber mood of the church and his thoughts. "Not a fan of the Gregorian monk hit parade?" he asks Ginny, opening his eyes. "I feel like him in The Exorcist." "Do you now?" Daniel says, almost laughing. "Talk about inappropriate." "I do. I'm just waiting for that old lady's head to spin around." This time he does laugh, releasing himself from more tension than he realized he held. He crosses himself again, genuflects quickly toward the altar, and turns to go with her. They are both still smirking a little as they walk up the narrow aisle. The old woman at her table watches them with a furrowed brow of disapproval. As they pass the table, she leans with her fossil-like frame toward them, then flicks another fly in the air. "Lo están siguiendo," she says, and crosses herself. Daniel stops and looks at her, but she folds her arms atop her chest and turns her face away from him as if in protest. He waits a little to see if she will say anything more, but she doesn't. He doesn't know what to say to her. His Spanish is so pathetic. Ginny has already gone outside and is not there to translate. "I'm sorry," Daniel says to the woman. No reaction. Is she deaf, or can she not hear him over the chanting? He tries once more with his limited knowledge of the local language. "No entiendo," he says. "I don't understand." She turns and looks at him again, repeating what she said before, but more slowly, punctuating each Spanish word with one bent and frighteningly hairy finger in the air. "Lo están siguiendo." Daniel doesn't understand any more than he did the first time. His confused look earns nothing more from her but a hand gesture, her index and pinky fingers held up like horns. It is a sign Daniel associates more with 80s heavy metal rock than with the Catholic Church. He assumes she is using it for its original purpose to ward off the evil eye, rather than to profess her undying love of Iron Maiden. When she turns away again with a huff, he gives up and walks out the door. Outside, he is surprised to see Ginny about to overtake the top of the first large hill that leads back to the main trail. She has gone on without him. In fact, she must have taken off at quite a clip to get so far in such a short time. Run even. He glances over and sees the low stone wall is unoccupied. The Dutchman has left as well. Nothing remains of his little picnic except a tattered piece of the checkered cloth caught on one of the rougher stones. It flutters in the breeze. This is grand, Daniel thinks. First I have a hairy old elf woman giving out to me, and now I've been ditched. He looks back up the hill, shielding his eyes from the high sun with his right hand to check whether Ginny has stopped to wait for him. He can just make out the last of her ponytail disappearing as she makes it hurriedly over the top of the hill. He can't help but feel offended. Was it the bit about the cows? Daniel grabs his hat roughly and puts it back on. Who cares, he says to himself. She was a bit of flake anyway. Besides, he likes to walk by himself. He is here for a purpose after all, not to go socializing. He bends over to pick up his backpack. When he stands up again, he sees it a dark shape moving out from a small grouping of trees at the crest of the hill. It advances slowly but purposefully from that hiding place and then out onto the path. Daniel is too far away to distinguish its features, but it is not the Dutchman, not tall enough. The figure disappears over the hill. It moves like one of those spy characters he used to watch in cartoons as a kid. It could be anyone, Daniel thinks. Perhaps another pilgrim that went to take a slash behind a tree. There aren't any public restrooms on the Camino. The world was their toilet. He doesn't really believe that, though. The person seemed to be lurking in the trees waiting until Ginny walked past. He keeps his eye on the rise as he tightens his backpack but sees nothing more. Just false intuition, he decides, brought on by the ridiculous chanting and talk of The Exorcist. He had always hated that shite movie. Only Hollywood could make a franchise out of a girl vomiting on a priest. Daniel is bent over retying one of his boot laces when he hears the scream. Alarmed, he looks up and hears it again. Jesus! He abandons the boot and races through the archway with the lace still trailing. Overworked leg muscles pump as he runs up the steep incline, trying not to trip. The backpack bangs back and forth behind him, the weight of it slamming with each stride into the small of his back. His lungs fill to capacity with air. His side births a searing pain. He shouldn't have eaten so much face-filled chorizo. Ginny, he shouts as he runs. Even at full speed, it takes some time to reach the peak of the incline. When he does, his heavy hiking boots slam down the other side of the hill, sending shock waves up the lower half of his body. He rounds the corner at the bottom and bends over, hands braced on his knees, panting. There is no one there. Just the trail stretching out ahead of him into the distance, hill after rolling hill obscuring his view. She could be anywhere. He is ready to start running again when a hand grabs his arm from behind. He whirls around, ready for attack. Relax. It is me. The Dutchman gives him a tentative look. Did you see Ginny? Daniel asks, still gasping for breath. Yes, Rob says. She has just left. She says she wishes to walk alone. You didn't hear a scream? Daniel asks him. No, the Dutchman says, drawing the word out, the way people do when they are not too sure about you. You weren't seeing anyone else? No, only her. Are you okay? Daniel from New Jersey. His concern is real. Even Daniel can see that. There is no reason not to believe him. Everything is quiet except for the far off sound of a tractor, the chirping of birds. She said she wanted to walk alone. He asks Rob again. His breath is returning, his voice less strained. The chorizo settles back down in his stomach. Yes, he says, waiting patiently for Daniel to calm himself. Pretty girl, he adds as an aside. I suppose, Daniel admits, his panic moving toward embarrassment. This is the second time he has behaved like a lunatic today, running toward the same woman. His mother would be proud. He looks over at the long dirt trail ahead until it disappears into foothills and spent fields. Everyone has a story, Rob says, following his gaze. Sure, Daniel says, bending over again to tie up his boot lace, still trying to catch his breath. I believe I may have heard that before. Only later, when he parts ways with the Dutchman and is signing in at the albergue in Urbanos, does Daniel remember what the old lady said, asking the hospitalero for a translation. Daniel's tongue hacks at the language like a crowbar. Eventually the Spanish innkeeper picks up the pieces and understands him. Followed, he says in English, stamping Daniel's pilgrim passport, then returning it to him with his identification and change for €10. It means you are followed. Daniel walks upstairs feeling uneasy, but he is too tired to care. He finds his bunk bed and collapses on it, patting the bottom of his backpack protectively. Everyone has a story, Petra, he says as he closes his eyes wearily. The woman in the next bunk bed discreetly moves herself and her gear to another room, mindful of lunatics and perverts. He is too exhausted to notice. That night Daniel dreams in the sparse bunk bed of the albergue at Urbanos. What he saw then, what he sees now. It all comes together into an impossible tangle in his subconscious. Like the wax-leafed trees that line the path in his mind, choking out the light as he loses his way on the road to Santiago. In the dream, he has just spread Petra's ashes, but they blow up against him as he walks, clinging to his hiking pants along with the greasy wet leaves that have fallen on the trail. Petra appears behind him, then on either side. A ghost in triplicate, each version a beast with a different type of claws. One as she was, one as she became, and one as he last saw her, dark with death. The three versions of his wife rise up in front of him like mountains, then become one, blocking his way. He falls to his knees on the sharp gravel of the path and begs for her forgiveness. In answer, she turns to stone. He will never get past her now. The sun sets on the slab of her face as he sobs into his hands. She knows his story, and she will never let him forget it. Chapter 3. Urbanos to Asqueta. The next morning, Daniel sits at a patio table in front of the AudioBook where he can connect to the Wi-Fi. He is nursing a coffee with gloved hands while he Skypes his sister on his smartphone. Angela's at the farm with their parents visiting for the weekend. He can hear his father shouting in the background, his mother telling him to cop himself on the Irish version of "Get Your Shit Together." These are the reassuring sounds of home. "How are you?" Angela asks with a bit of hesitation. She worries about him. He has to call regularly to assure her he is not dead or wallowing in self-pity. She takes her big sister role seriously, even though their birthdays are only 10 months apart. Irish twins, as people call them. That is, all the people who aren't actually Irish. "I'm better," Daniel says, and realizes he is. Despite having had a rough night, he feels more relaxed this morning, more in tune with his surroundings. Still, the nightmare from last night lingers, made worse by jumping out of bed and falling flat on his face in his twisted mummy sleeping bag. The two Spanish guys he bunked with laugh and point at him every time they walk by. "You'd like this place where I'm staying," he tells her. Urbanos. The church has a human skull in a box on the wall. You could test it for DNA. Angela is a nurse but also an addict of forensic crime shows. He has never understood how, after spending all day knee-deep in bodily fluids, she could be so interested in the angle of blood splatter and autopsies. "I read online about that skull," she says. She'd been experiencing his journey on the Camino vicariously, reading up on the sights and scenery as her brother passed them. She had wanted to come with him but couldn't get the time off work. "Was it St. William it belonged to?" she asks. "It was," he says, proud of her for knowing. He murdered his sister for going to Santiago instead of getting married. Then felt such the maggot he became a devout hermit and died destitute in a cave. He had learned all this from the Spanish guys who spoke good English when they weren't laughing at him. Every year they take his skull out and parade it down the street on a stick for the annual Passion Play. Let that be a warning to you, Danny boy. They both laugh. God, he loves his sister. She's the only person who can call him Danny boy without getting a pop in the jaw. Daniel is fairly close to his two older brothers, both now living in England, but it's just not the same as with Angela. Still smiling, he looks over at another table and sees a woman from last night's AudioBook putting her hair in a ponytail. It reminds him. "I walked with someone yesterday," he confesses. At least, it feels like a confession. "Really?" Angela says, drawing the two syllables out with interest. "Did the someone have a name by any chance?" "Virginia," Daniel says. "Jenny." He's not sure why he's telling Angela about her. She's from California. Where is she now, then? Daniel thinks about the figure he thought he saw come out of the trees, his frantic run up the hill, believing he'd heard Ginny scream. "She ditched me," he says. "Well, then she cannot be a woman of any appreciable taste," Angela pronounces. "Or perhaps you told her that bit about the skull on the stick. Not all women like a good tale of saint decapitation. You could scare a girl away with that sort of shite." Daniel should laugh, but he goes quiet instead. He doesn't like this talk of scaring Ginny away. It sounds too much like he was trying to attract her in the first place. He's not ready for that. "Are you sure you're all right?" Angela asks him. "I am," he says. He's not about to tell his sister about what happened at the Templar Church or how he mistook Ginny for Petra on the Alto del Perdon. She'd be calling the Spanish Guardia to have him committed. "Have you been taking the pills the doctor gave you for your nerves?" Daniel flinches at the question. He doesn't like to think of himself as a man with nerves. Plus, he has the eerie feeling she was able to see into his thoughts just now. "I have," he says, quickly recovering. "Every day with my coffee." He raises up his coffee cup so she can see it on the Skype feed. "I reckon it balances out with the stimulant effect of the caffeine." Daniel had been having a tough time just before he left for the Camino. Nightmares like the one he had last night. Awakening to screams like he thought he heard yesterday. He'd searched the house for Petra, convinced it was her calling for him. After he checked every room, he'd collapse on their bed, remembering that all that was left of her was settled in the bottom of the ostentatious urn on the top shelf of his closet. He hated the look of that urn. Once he had even taken the ugly little ceramic down from its hiding place and thrown it against the wall. He'd been drinking. It hadn't broken, but the incident frightened him enough to go see a doctor. Thus, the pills his sister was on about. Daniel doesn't like pills. A friend had given him some Ambien when he suffered from insomnia during Petra's first hospital stay. At 2 a.m, he awoke to find himself in his elderly neighbor's backyard wearing nothing but a barbecue apron. Ever since, the old girl had been regularly baking him muffins and leaving them on the front stoop. "Have you spread Petra's ashes yet?" Angela asks, getting to the point. Damn it, this is a subject he wants to avoid even more than Mrs. Bodice muffins. "I think we have a bad connection," he shouts at the phone, as you do when you can't hear the other person properly. Angela's eyes narrow on the video display. She knows when she's being played. He grabs the sugar dispenser off the table and starts pouring the white granules out above the screen like snow. "Sure, you're breaking up, Angela. I think I'm going to have to sign off. Just spread the feckin' ashes, Daniel. It's been long enough. Talk to you soon." He smiles back broadly, ignoring her, then presses the disconnect icon. They may be close, but Angela doesn't understand about Petra. He needs just the right moment to let go of her. For Christ's sake, had written that woman a poem every day they were apart during their long-distance courtship. Had found them after she was gone, tied up with a red ribbon in a shoebox under the bed. You just don't spread the ashes of a woman like that lightly. Even if it has been long enough and your dad is waiting for you to come take over the farm of your ancestors. There is a time for everything, and Daniel will not be pushed. He picks up the phone from where it was propped on the table and slips it into the side pocket of his backpack, right next to the pill bottle with the prescription he had dutifully filled before he left home but has never touched. It is only the second time in his life he has ever lied to his sister. He finishes the last gulp of coffee and gets ready to walk. The first time, of course, was the day Petra died. Daniel bumps into the Dutchman just outside of Puente la Reina, a fairly built-up town with a cathedral and lots of bars and restaurants. All of them were closed when he had walked through, unfortunately. Too early in the day, particularly for Spain. The urban centre has now given way to vineyards and olive trees, all barren and asleep until next spring. "Hello, Daniel," Rob calls to him from where he has stopped ahead on the path to take a picture of a grotto. People have left stones and pieces of paper, along with ribbons and medallions. All this spiritual flotsam surrounds a ceramic blue and white figurine of the Virgin Mary, giving the unfortunate appearance that the saint stands atop a garbage dump. Daniel waves. The Dutchman waits for him and they fall in walking together. "Did you enjoy your Albig in Urbanos?" Daniel Rob asks him. "I did," Daniel says, then corrects himself. "Not really, no." He notices dark circles under the Dutchman's eyes. "How was your night?" "I stayed in Puente la Reina in a large albergue with many sleeping places," Rob tells him. "I am very tired this morning." By sleeping places, Rob means beds. Pilgrims often judge the albergues laid out in the guidebook by the number of beds and try to stay away from those with larger volumes. Daniel had stayed in one albergue where 90 people were housed in one room. The combined snoring alone was enough to break a man's eardrum. "That's a shame," Daniel says. "And then, I wasn't after sleeping very well either." "Too many dreams of the pretty Ginny from California?" Rob asks him with a knowing look. "No," Daniel protests. "I mean, it's not like that." "Geez, will people just lay off him with the romantic innuendo?" Rob holds up his open palms toward him in the universal gesture of no harm no foul. "Don't worry, Daniel. I understand. I have a woman friend on the Camino like this, too." "A Canadian. Where is she?" Daniel asks. "Oh, I don't know. Nearby, I am sure. We walk together sometimes and sometimes alone. It is a relaxing relationship, but we are very close." Did you know her before you came on the Camino? No, Rob laughs. You are like my wife with this question. Daniel is not surprised that Rob's wife would ask such a question. He doesn't think Petra would have much appreciated it if he had gone around getting close to other women while away for over a month in another country. But it is like sister love, I explained to her. Rob turns and looks at Daniel to see if he gets his meaning. The Camino, it is like what you Americans have, what is it called, summer camp. Daniel didn't grow up with the American experience of summer camp, but he knows what the Dutchman means. You get attached to people fairly quickly, Daniel says. Yes, Rob replies, pleased to be understood. As they crest the top of the gradual incline they've been walking, he cries out like a man on a ship sighting land, and there she is. Daniel looks out across a flat bowl of a valley. He can make out the small village of Soakwe perched on the other side of it on the next hilltop. From this vantage point he can see the groove carved by the winding narrow road as it makes its way into the village and then back out into the countryside going west. At the base of the elevation, a tall woman with a red and black backpack sits on a bench at the side of the trail sipping from a water bottle. She waves, and they both wave back. The Dutchman is grinning with such intensity that Daniel thinks it must hurt his face. Only sister love, so Daniel asks, raising both eyebrows. Yes, well, I love my wife, Rob tells him, but sometimes she asks too many questions. Daniel leaves Rob behind with his Canadian sister friend at a cafe in Soakwe. The relationship appeared to be no more than platonic affection despite the Dutchman's bravado. He hadn't struck Daniel as the philandering type anyway, whatever that type was. Daniel always got the term mixed up with philanthropy, as if benevolence held ties with infidelity, both giving till it hurt. The woman seemed pleasant enough, though, even if she hadn't said a word to him as they walked up the hill to the village. To be fair, the steep inclines could make conversation tough. It was hard enough to regulate your breathing as you hiked up to some of these medieval hillside towns without adding talking to the mix. The villages had been built that way so the inhabitants could see an enemy coming from a long way off. Daniel wonders if the real trick was that half of their enemies dropped dead of a coronary before they reached the top. When they were climbing the last bit, Daniel had made a nervous sideways glance at Rob, remembering what Head said about his heart. But the Dutchman didn't even seem to breathe hard with the effort. After leaving the couple, Daniel passes through an arch off the main square and exits the village onto a single-span Roman bridge, curved and solid. The engineer in him admires these classically built-to-last structures. The poet in him appreciates the irony that they long outlasted the empire for which they were built. Daniel has been walking for a while on his own when he sees another example ahead, this one spanning two arches over a limited river. Some lowing brush sits on either side, including those bushes with the dried-up yellow flowers that, even this late in the year, overwhelm him with their sweet fragrance. He saw flowers like these before coming to Spain, in France in early spring, his honeymoon spent with Petra. The scent was so intense through the window of the broken-down pension where they stayed, that his new wife had thought her floral body wash had exploded in their suitcase. It had been so easy then, lying under the sparse bedspread, exploring each other over long days and endless bottles of French wine that somehow never made them drunk. Instead it fortified them just enough to get up out of their rumpled bed by evening to go out in search of dinner. Look, she had said on the way to the restaurant, pointing out the yellow arrows that would lead a person all the way to Spain and Santiago. They had made love so often his hips twinged when he walked. I know I took off and everything, but that doesn't mean you have to hunt me down like you're some kind of bloodhound. Ginny is sitting on the grass at the riverside, twisting a small branch with yellow flowers in her hand. It takes Daniel a moment to process her presence as well as her comment. He had been standing there with his eyes closed, sniffing the scent of the fading flowers like a dog. He decides he could make a living out of looking like an ass in front of women. The flowers, he says in weak explanation. Ginny nods, glances down at the ones she holds in her hand. Listen, I'm sorry about the way I left things. She stands up and walks over to him, dropping the branch on the ground. But that old woman and that place. It just freaked me out. Sure, I understand, Daniel agrees, remembering the flies and the gnarled finger punctuating foreign Spanish words in the air. The old girl at the desk. Now there was a weird one, Ginny says, turning away to squint into the sunlight. What harm, but she told me we were being followed, Daniel tells her. Then she made the sign of the horns. Are you serious? Did she consult her Ouija board or her magic 8-ball for that information? Ginny asks. And then that smile again, and he can't help but return it. Is it sister love, like the Dutchman said? Maybe. He finds himself no longer wanting to talk about yesterday. They walk over and stand on the middle of the Roman bridge together. The shallow water moves lethargically beneath them. Do you know what this river is called? He asks her, bursting at the seams. Rio Salado, she says, not missing a beat. That's right, Daniel says, turning to her surprised and more than a little disappointed. How did you know? It means salt river. It's toxic, she says, wrinkling her freckled nose a tiny bit. Sure, but do you know what they were after doing here? He says, trying to outfence her with facts. Then, feeling a tad self-conscious, adds, sorry, I'm what you might call a trivia junkie. That's all right. I want to know. Tell me. Okay, Daniel says, encouraged. He extends his arm out toward where she was just sitting. In the Middle Ages, the Basques would wait for pilgrims to come and water their horses here. After they died, they would skin them for the meat. The pilgrims or the horses, Ginny quips. Funny girl. They stand on the old stone bridge and watch over the side together. You already knew the story, now didn't you? Yeah. She giggles. It's a sound that has always delighted him in women. Ginny raises her eyes from the slow-moving water, starts scanning the other side of the riverbank. She turns when she sees he has noticed. Just making sure I didn't forget anything, she explains. I hate when that happens. Daniel agrees, remembering how he got lost in Pamplona and had to retrace his steps. When you're walking 12 miles a day, you don't want to add even a dozen yards due to stupidity. Nobody wants to go back on the way, he says. Ginny looks down at the water and nods slowly in agreement. The sluggish current gurgling over the rocks is the only audible reply. He has hit a nerve, it appears. Daniel stands and waits for the pensive moment to pass. When it does, they cross together to the other side of the bridge and start back on the trail without comment. So, are you a history teacher or just worried? He asks after a few minutes, trying to draw her out. He is also curious. Not many people know about things like the Salt River. I'm a librarian, Ginny tells him. You're having me on. What, you expected the bun, the glasses, a pair of sensible shoes. It is a very warm day for the fall, and Ginny has rolled up the sleeves of her fleece and zipped off the bottoms of her pant legs, converting them to shorts. He can see the sleek defined muscles of her calves, the tautness of her forearms. She holds her body with a sinewy strength, not unlike the horse his sister kept during her Black Beauty phase. Not the type of body he'd expect to see behind a returns desk. You'd have to be fairly thick to come on the Camino without sensible shoes, Daniel tells her. He's trying to be funny but has ended up sounding like a maiden aunt. He moves on to something else, hoping she didn't notice. Sure, but your knowledge seems a bit skewed toward medieval barbarism. Masked knights, skinned horses, and the like. Why is that? Well, it might have to do with the library I work in, she says as she reaches her hands behind her back and lifts and lowers her pack from the bottom in an effort to redistribute the weight. Really now, Daniel says. Where is it that you work? San Quentin. The prison. Daniel almost chokes on the beef jerky he was snacking on. Well, it's not the all-inclusive resort. She pauses. Although, maybe it is. But I'd give it a really bad review on TripAdvisor. No doubt. What's it like working there? I have to wear a pendant with a panic button around my neck, but other than that pretty much the same as other libraries, she says, taking her aluminum hiking poles from the little loop on her backpack and extending them to be used for the upcoming incline. The thing is, we get quite a few requests for books about murder and mayhem, if you know what I mean. We don't like to give them the more modern stuff. Too stimulating. So we bring in a lot on the Spanish Inquisition and other medieval history. Sometimes I get bored and read them. I'll keep an eye on my horse. They walk for a while without speaking. Their pace is well matched, but soon the conversation between them begins to flow with the current of the trail. They move up the inclines ending in hilltop villages and down again into the surrounding countryside, remarking from time to time on architecture or the natural beauty surrounding them. Each tries to one-up the other with Albug horror stories of snoring and stinky feet. They compare notes on what they packed for the trip, how much weight they carry, and the status of blisters. Daniel, still without any Ginny admitting to a minute one between pinky toe and the one beside it. He tells her a bit about growing up in rural Ireland, how he left the farm to get his engineering degree at Trinity College in Dublin. She owns up to a suburban childhood in Orange County, where her parents were neither divorced nor former hippies, making her the odd girl out among her peers. When they come to Estella, a larger town where Daniel had planned to stay the night, they both agree that the Albugs are too crowded, the urban scene not their style. They stop and eat their simple packed lunches on a park bench before continuing on through the city centre and back out of it. They set their sights on Villamé de Montjardin, where the views are supposed to be spectacular, even though it is still 5 miles away and their shadows are getting longer on the path. That would turn out to be a big mistake, but they don't know that now, too at ease with the day and each other's company. Daniel looks at his watch and realizes they have been walking together for hours, but it doesn't feel like it. They have been so engrossed in sharing their various experiences. His grandfather always told him that to shorten the road. He supposes he was right about that, as he was about most things involving the subtle observation of human nature. His grandmother claimed it came from a lifetime of sitting on his ass watching the world go by. Ginny's gone quiet. When he looks over, he notices her lips are held tightly together, suppressing a grin. She's up to something, but Daniel isn't sure what until they reach the narrow end of a large rectangular building with a brushed silver-plated recess built into the outer stone wall. 2 spigots jet out from raised images of scalloped shells, all below a large Spanish coat of arms. The cross of St. James with its telltale pointed spade at the base, as if you could pound it into the earth, is etched between the 2 taps. Ginny had told him earlier she doesn't like these crosses, they look too much like daggers. She rushes up to the wall and stretches out her arms like a girl about to turn letters on a game show. Daniel can read some of what is written around the coat of arms now, bronze on silver, Fuente de Iraque. The monastery of Iraque was established here about 1,000 years ago, Ginny tells him. It was built for 2 reasons. One was to take care of the increasing number of pilgrims that came through on their way to Santiago. And what was the second reason? To perfect the recipe for a kick-ass shiraz, she says. Daniel examines more closely the spigots embedded in the wall. He realizes they each have a plaque with a Spanish word mounted above them. One says agua, the other vino. He also remembers now what the word fuente means. Sure, is this what I think it is, he asks her, not believing what he's seeing. Yup, Ginny says, dropping her pack, pulling out her plastic water bottle and dumping the contents out to make room. It's a wine fountain. Aye, now that's grand, Daniel says. They both fill up their water bottles. And not from the spigot marked agua. Afterward, they make their way up the path behind the fountain, laughing, confident in their ability to make it to Villamé de Montjardin. Later, Daniel will wish they had stayed where they were. It is starting to cool off as they walk up the hill on a close path through the trees. The warmth of the wine keeps them from putting on their jackets even as the day starts to fade and the trees block the sun. Ginny bursts out in giggles when a branch pushed aside by Daniel comes back and whacks her in the face. He apologizes but laughs himself. The physical work of walking all day and their increased fatigue have combined with the alcohol to give them both a fairly comfortable buzz. I cannot believe a man can get free wine out of a fountain in this country, Daniel says. Back in his Trinity days, such a thing would cause a riot. Did you find out about it through your study of murder and mayhem in the prison library? No, I'm a California girl. We have the uncanny ability to detect the scent of complimentary wine from 100 paces. And I'm Irish, but we can't sniff out free Guinness, no matter how hard some of my forefathers may have tried. I read it in the guidebook, she says. You really should do more than look at the pictures, she teases him. Sure, the pictures are the best part, he teases back. They make their way out of the trees and emerge on a wider country road skirting cornfields. The field has not been harvested yet, though it is late in the year. Tall stalks of bleached-out yellow leaves rustle with the breeze. No one else is around. Just the two of them. His buzz is starting to fade with the daylight. Why are you here? Daniel Ginny asks him, after she swallows another sample of the tart red wine. As she lowers her water bottle, a colorful beaded bracelet with little silver shells trembles on her wrist. It sets off the deep tan of her arms and makes him think of the California beaches she must have grown up on. On the Camino, you're saying? I guess so, she replies. Daniel finishes off the wine in his own bottle and then decides the best way to answer is with brutal honesty. My wife died. It sounds so flat, so insufficient, using those three loaded words to sum up so much. He thinks he can feel the brown burlap bag at the bottom of his backpack shift with disappointment. He hadn't thought about Petra or her ashes since he started walking with Ginny this morning. Guilt sets in. I'm so sorry, Ginny says. Daniel clears his throat a few times, but he can't form the words he wants to say. It would do him good to unload it all to this virtual stranger. But his fear and the guilt in his backpack won't let him do it. He decides to deflect the conversation onto Ginny's domestic situation, a serpentine move but the best he can muster on short notice. You married? I was, she says, her playfulness at bay for once. But it's over. That's a shame. What happened? He asks, trying to keep the focus on her. We were out celebrating our anniversary over dinner and I suddenly realized I couldn't think of even one reason why we were together. When I asked him, neither could he. She watches the western horizon as they walk. The sun is low in the sky, almost touching the tops of the cornstalks. There's not much point in staying in a marriage when nobody knows why they're there. She shrugs her shoulders. That and he never laughed at my jokes. And you being such the card. Yeah, hard to believe, isn't it? Is that why you're after walking by yourself? She straightens her shoulders, juts out her chin. Had been trying to keep things light, but the tension in her body denotes a seriousness not present before. Maybe he should have asked if she had any pets instead. I was supposed to come with a friend, but she pulled out at the last minute, she says, scanning the horizon and the setting sun again. It will be dark soon and they are still 2 miles from Monjardin. Is that so? Daniel says. He means the question as empathetic surprise rather than a challenge. But she takes it the wrong way. What, you think I couldn't get someone to come with me? Her voice is sharp. For the first time, Daniel's head starts to suffer from the wine they drank. I only meant it must be tough, now. To have had to come on your own, he says, backtracking. He really should shut his mouth. Surely he had lived with a woman long enough to know when to do that. You're alone, she points out. Well, of course, but you're a woman. The expression on Ginny's face causes his testicles to retreat slightly. You sound like my mother. Jesus. She picks up her pace, her head down as she walks on ahead of him. Shite, Daniel thinks, falling in behind. Next time I'll just ask if she has a cat. They stop so that Ginny can zip the bottoms of her pant legs back on and to put on their jackets. It is hitting dusk, and they are still nowhere near the albergue they were shooting for. Daniel has finally consulted the guidebook and realizes he misjudged the distance to Monjardin back in Estella. The road has become steep, but the endless rows of drooping cornstalks continue beside them up the hill. His head is truly throbbing now with the remnants of the wine and his own exertion. "Do you have a flashlight?" Ginny asks him. "I was going to bring one, but I didn't want to carry the extra weight." Daniel opens the zippered pouch on his hip belt and extracts what he grew up calling a torch. He pushes the rubber button on the side and a weak beam appears on the road ahead of them. It bounces on the dirt and gravel with each of his steps. "Listen, about earlier," Ginny says, in delayed apology for her outburst. "I guess I'm just tired." So is Daniel. He figures it has been 10 hours since he left the little albergue in Obanos. His boots feel as if they're cast in cement as he lifts them one in front of the other up the never-ending hill. Since they can't see to the top in the dark, it really does feel like it could go on forever. No harm, he tells her. He is less concerned about their squabble than he is about their progress. They need to get somewhere, anywhere, and soon. He thinks he can make out the deep purple outline of buildings off in the distance for a moment, and then decides it's only wishful thinking. His lips feel dry and cracked. He is thirsty as hell. The 2 water bottles in his pack went dry a long time ago. The night is completely silent, none of the twilight sounds he remembers in the fields of his youth. The reassuring low of cattle as his father called them in from pasture. The noisy chirping of rooks settling in for the evening. The only noise here is the crunch of their footfalls on the hard gravel. He is casting his flashlight in its limited range up the road when he sees the crouched human figure in the corn. It runs across the path in front of them and behind a crumbling rock fence. "What the fuck was that?" he cries out, looking over at Ginny. She is not moving. "Oh shit," she says. The figure runs in front of them again, loping awkwardly back into the cornstalks. Daniel cannot discern much in the dwindling light. A mass of tangled hair, a pair of heavy hiking boots. "Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit," Ginny repeats over and over, backing away. "Wait here," he says to her, and takes off into the corn. He moves before thinking. Ginny calls out for him to stay, but he is too furious to respond. He has been walking for miles, it's late, and his skull feels like it holds back a mushroom cloud. Now some tosser wants to play games with him in the dark. He is not sure what he is going to do as he roughly parts the corn and plunges inside, but it's not going to be sportsmanlike. The quiet night is amplified inside the dense corn. He can hear Ginny faintly shouting from the road to come back, but the tall dry stalks seal him in with their tight silence, like a vacuum or the lid of a coffin. He continues to move deeper through the rows, holding up the next osseless flashlight, watching for bent leaves or other hints of where the figure has gone. He is about to give up when he hears breathing, laboured and raspy, as if the windpipe were obstructed or had undergone an emergency tracheotomy. His sister had told him about one she had performed in the field, cutting open a man's throat with a knife and inserting the shaft of a ballpoint pen. Doctors Without Borders were nurses too. Daniel slowly pushes through toward the rasping sound. The outline of a figure in a red fleece sweater comes into view up on his left, standing still in the corn. Is it a child? No, not that small, but not that big either. Probably around the same height as Ginny. Maybe a teenager. Daniel's anger softens a little. "Bloody kids. I don't know what you're at, but you scared the hell out of us back there." No response, no movement, just that beleaguered breath. Daniel moves closer, tries again. "Listen, I don't want any trouble, but it's late, all right." He takes a deep breath and sighs. Jesus, he's tired. "Why don't you clear off home and quit frightening people, mate?" Still no response. Maybe the guy doesn't speak English, Daniel thinks. Although, the young people here were more likely to be bilingual than their parents. He takes a step closer and raises the flashlight beam to the kid's face. Except he can't see the face. Only what's left of it, through stringy clumps of hair. A thick protruding tongue sticks out, swollen and bulbous, the cracked lips and teeth only partially visible behind it. Just before Daniel drops the flashlight, he sees a large shiny black beetle crawl out of the mouth, then back in again, using the slack grey chin as a breech. He turns and runs through the tall corn with no idea where he is going. Back to the path or farther into the field, he can't tell. He is moving on primal energy, not toward anything, only away from what he saw. The blood-sharp edges of the scorched leaves cut into his hands, their pointed tips stabbing at his face as he plunges through the rows of dried-up stalks in the dark. When he bursts out onto the road, Ginny is ahead of him, mounting the hill as fast as she can, tripping at times in her haste and exhaustion. He runs after her, catching up just as they enter the walls of the hamlet of Asquita. When she threatens to fall again, he grabs her by the arm and steadies her. Together they stagger down the only street of the tiny village. The stone houses that line it are closed up for the night, cool and silent. Daniel can see a dimly lit sign up ahead, a black shell with white lettering, La Perla Negra. Hung above it is a blue square plaque with a white letter A, the accommodation symbol for Alberg. Ginny is openly sobbing now as he pulls her up the street and in through the arch of the entranceway. Just before he slams the heavy oak of the door behind them, he sees the dark figure across the square hovering at the edge of the village. The head hangs low as it drifts above the moonlit farmer's field. The tips of its slack hiking boots drag on the feathery tops of the withering corn. Daniel holds both of his hands fast against the rough wood planks of the door when he shuts it, as if he can hold back what he has seen with his own brute strength. He can feel splinters beginning to embed in his palms. He only takes his hands away when he hears the hospitalero call from up the stairs. Daniel turns to face him, the terror still in his eyes, but the middle-aged man in his house sandals doesn't seem to notice. "DNDE has estado, Peregrino," the man says. Daniel doesn't understand him, of course. He looks all around the foyer of the albergue for Ginny to translate. He cannot see her. "I don't understand," Daniel says, not able to conjure up any of his limited Spanish. He looks up the stairs. Ginny must have run up to the top floor while he was trying to hold held back with his bare hands and an oak door. "DNDE has estado, Peregrino," the man repeats again. The canned laughter from a television drifts out from a room off the landing behind him. His private flat. A son in his 20s steps out through the doorway and stands alongside his father. He said, "Where have you been, Pilgrim?" the young man translates using perfect English. And Daniel must admit to himself that in that moment he no longer knows. Chapter 4. Asquita to Torres del Rio. In the morning, Daniel paces back and forth on a thick braided oval rug in the common room of the albergue, waiting for Ginny. He hadn't even made it to a bed in the men's quarters last night. After settling with the hospitalero and going upstairs in a daze, he had dropped his pack and collapsed on the overgrown love seat a few steps away. Beyond that he remembers nothing until he woke up and saw the spackled whitewashed walls of the common room glinting in the morning sun. Earthy clayware and rustic Spanish accents surround him on all sides. It feels like being trapped in a bonanza-themed window display for Pottery Barn. Up in the far corner of the room a bird's nest is built into the wall where it meets the adobe ceiling. He imagines the windows thrown open in summertime to allow barn swallows to fly in and out, a calming, pastoral thought. Then he remembers what he saw in the corn and goes to make sure the sashes are locked. Frustrated, he drops heavily into a wood and leather armchair, pushing aside the colourful striped blanket draped over the back. Asquita wasn't even supposed to have any lodging for pilgrims. Daniel had checked earlier in the guidebook. That's why they had set their sights on Mondardin yesterday. He wishes he could go see what is keeping Ginny, but he is barred by the invisible line drawn across the entrance to the women's bedroom. Pilgrims aren't usually divided by gender, but the albergue is under capacity, allowing for separate quarters. A treat for the women, he's sure. The two Spanish guys in Urbanos had waited outside the communal showers with their junk hanging out the day before yesterday. Daniel considers himself more of a gentleman than that, so he waits impatiently outside the bedroom door. A porcelain jug of water has been set out on a long oak table by the stairs. He goes over and pours himself a glass, choking down a couple of aspirin for his growing headache. What he really needs is coffee and some breakfast, but there is nowhere to get food in Asquita. He's asked. Even if there were, he can't step out and run the risk of missing Ginny. He needs to talk to her about what happened last night. Who else can he discuss it with? The hospitalero is already giving him suspicious looks, and not just because he knocked over a large potted cactus before he passed out on the loveseat. The bedroom door finally opens and a spindly middle-aged woman emerges. It is hard for Daniel to believe she has the muscle mass to walk the Camino. Her limbs look like twigs that might snap at any moment. Between that and her deep mahogany tan, she bears a startling resemblance to the beef jerky in his pocket. "Excuse me," Daniel says, standing. "Yes," the twig woman answers. Her stiff accent is laced with a faint hostility. He recognizes her now. She had poked her head out the bedroom door when he checked in the night before, asked what time it was, first in German and then in English. He had ignored her, too scattered inside his own mind to form an answer in any language. She obviously has chosen not to forget the slight. "I was wondering if you might see if my friend is still sleeping," Daniel asks her, plastering his best winning smile on a face lined with stress. "Her name is Ginny. She has a backpack same as mine." Daniel indicates his turquoise pack still propped against the couch. "There are no more women left," the German lady says as she picks up her hiking poles from a sizable unglazed urn at the top of the stairs. For a second, Daniel thinks she means in general, as if all of her sex has disappeared off the face of the earth, or at least off of the Camino. She misinterprets his reaction as a challenge. "Check for yourself," she says, indicating the open door to the bedroom. Daniel walks over and has a look inside. There are 4 beds in the small room. Only one appears slept in. The others have rough grey blankets pulled up tight on the bed frames, the pillows undented. Somebody must have made up the other bed, Daniel thinks, although that doesn't make a lot of sense. The sheets were stripped and washed daily in the albergues, not for aesthetics but to avoid the much-feared spread of bedbugs. It was redundant to make your bed. Daniel rushes out of the bedroom and catches the German woman as she is making her way down the stairs. "When did she leave?" he asks her, leaning over the banister. "When did who leave?" she says, looking up from the landing, annoyed at being delayed. "The other woman who was with you, in the ladies' quarters. She came in late last night with me." "There is no other woman. Only me," she says, turning to continue down to the ground floor. He listens as her hiking poles click away like a metronome on the hard-tiled steps. Daniel returns to the bedroom and looks again, scanning the floor, the deeply recessed window. He checks under all 3 of the beds as if Ginny were a misplaced sock. Nothing. He finds another bird's nest built above the inner door frame with 2 black swallows' silhouettes painted on either side. They are rendered shadows of the real thing he had imagined in the common room this morning. Leaning against the wall, he feels the cool adobe plaster against his temple. The angle gives him a new perspective out the window. He sees the sharp edges of black metal steps hugging the outer wall of the albergue. Stepping out to the hallway, he tries the door that he previously assumed led to another bedroom. Opening it, he is hit by the bracing freshness of the outdoors. A fire escape crisscrosses its way down to spill out in a side alley connected to the main street. He braces himself with one hand in the doorway, looks out across the rooftops of Asquita to where the Camino exits the village and disappears in the distance. He tries to picture Ginny darting out into the night without him, vanishing into the air where the sky meets the trail, with that dark figure floating above the fields behind her. Like the shadow of a bird in flight. The road to Villamé de Monjardin is even steeper than the road to Asquita. Daniel's shirt is damp with sweat despite the chill of the morning. On the outskirts of the village, he passes by a 13th century pilgrim fountain no longer in use. Under a set of impressive double arches, the water stagnates in a murky pool. A white film floats on top and the odor is not a pleasant one. It doesn't improve his headache. Walking alone with only his own thoughts, he cannot help but become obsessive. He turns over the events of the last few days in his mind like numbers to a combination lock. There must be some logical sequence to explain things, he thinks. Mistaking Ginny for Petra or hearing screams that aren't there, both of those could be written off to tired eyes or a suggestible mind. Seeing the wretched creature in the farmer's field, though, now that's a whole other level of madness. Daniel wants to blame the wine fountain, dehydration, fatigue, anything for that. Anything, that is, except the failing of his own mind. And yet, that laboured breathing in the corn, the tongue bloated and black in his flashlight beam, he could have sworn to it, as he would have sworn to what had seen hovering on the outskirts of Asquita just before he slammed the door of the albergue shut behind him last night. He can't imagine Ginny going back out into the night after seeing that half-human thing following them, and she must have seen something. She was obviously frightened. In his experience, a woman doesn't normally repeat the phrase "oh shit" over and over like a mantra unless something is definitely out of sorts. Why did she leave the albergue without him, and what if something had happened to her? Had overheard a conversation that morning in the albergue about a woman who'd gone missing on the trail. Perhaps what they'd seen was somehow responsible. It sends his worry up another notch. All of this is coursing through his mind as he comes to the gates of Monjardin. Above him, a high rock wall spirals around the conical peak that holds the ruins of the village Castillo. Daniel can just make out the remains of the castle keep from his vantage point as he mounts a wide stone staircase to the village square. He wonders who the Castilians had sought to keep out with the sharpened rock edges notched into the top of the defensive walls. Who, he thinks, or what? When he cranes his neck to get a better look, a fresh burst of pain blossoms in his brain. He still hasn't gotten that coffee he needs, or any food, and as he tops the staircase to the Plaza Mayor, it doesn't look like he's going to get either. Everything is closed until lunchtime. He has missed the morning rush. The plaza is abandoned, except for a man with a painter's cap sitting at a round zinc table in the sun. He is eating a large banana. "Hello, Daniel," the Dutchman calls out to him. He takes one last bite and then tucks the banana peel away into the zippered pocket of his hip belt. Daniel hadn't realized the Dutch were so careful with their trash. Must be the influence of his Canadian friend, a people more likely to crush a hand in a bench vice than litter. "Hello, Rob," Daniel calls back, relieved to see him. There are times when it is good to be alone on the Camino. This morning isn't one of them. He waits while Rob straps on his backpack and walks over to join Daniel in the middle of the square. "Here, I cannot finish this." Rob holds out a large coffee in a travel cup to Daniel, mostly full. "There is a God." "Thanks," he says, taking a deep swallow. It burns going down but tastes brilliant. Black and highly caffeinated, just the way he likes it when he needs to clear his head. "Where's the Canadian sister friend?" Daniel asks, trying to stay casual, as the two walk in the direction of a yellow arrow painted on the cobblestones. It takes them toward an alleyway off the square. "Oh, her," Rob says, shrugging his shoulders. "She has left the way to be with her family." He leans on his wooden walking staff, a piece of leather at the top looped around his wrist. "Some are like this here. A princess pilgrim." He gives Daniel a wink. Serious pilgrims make fun of the ones who can't make it on the Camino, people who hire a service to carry their backpacks or who are too squeamish to stay at the albergues and opt for hotels. Even Daniel had spent a night in an upscale casa rural with a turn-down service once after a particularly difficult day. He hopes the Dutchman didn't see him. "That's a shame," Daniel says, identifying with the sudden loss of a walking partner. He watches for the next waymark and finds it placed high on the brick wall of a private home built off the alley. The sign has a bright yellow scallop shell with ribs fanning out from the base on a blue background. Someone told him the direction of the ribs points toward the cathedral in Santiago, but he's not convinced. Rob has now pulled a chocolate-covered Danish and another banana out of his backpack for him. The man is like a walking grocery store. Daniel accepts each offer of food with gratitude. The roar in his head retreats with each well-appreciated bite. "And what about your ginny?" Rob asks him, turning the subject around. "Don't even ask," Daniel says. Rob nods his head as if agreeing to something, and perhaps he is. The two men exchange a silence that speaks volumes on the complexity of women. Crossing onto a rural access road, they leave the village behind. "Rob, would you mind if I asked you something?" Daniel begins. He needs to talk to someone about this. "Ask away, my friend. Although if you are wondering if I sell drugs because I am from the Netherlands, the answer is no. A man asked me this in the queue for the showering once. It offends me." Daniel thinks of the Spanish guys and decides offensiveness in a shower lineup knows few limits on the Camino. "In all fairness, I hadn't been thinking of that, but good to know," he tells the Dutchman. "Then what is it you wish to ask?" Daniel hesitates for a moment, then dives in. "Have you been seeing anything strange like on the Camino?" "In what way strange?" "Something not easily explained." He can't believe he is saying this. "A manifestation, for example." Daniel is not sure if the Dutchman will understand the rarely used English word, but he surprises him. "Do you mean like these people who see the image of the Virgin burnt into their breakfast toast?" Rob asks. I would say no," Daniel says, relaxing a bit. "The Dutchman has that effect. This is good. I am not liking believers in such things. They are too religious for me," Rob says. Daniel agrees. Growing up in the country that he did, Catholicism is a big part of who he is, but he wears his faith like a comfortable coat that has seen him through a few winters. Anything flashier than that, his granny would have said, smacked of grandstanding or even worse, Presbyterianism. "I mean more like an apparition," Daniel tells him. This time he has stumped Rob with the unlikely word. "A ghost," he clarifies, feeling like an idiot. "Oh, a ghost. Boo, and like this. I understand. Now this is something the Dutch know something about. Much more than drugs." Rob glances over at Daniel and asks, "Do you know of de Village Hollander?" Daniel doesn't speak Dutch, but he took some German in secondary school, and the two languages are similar. He makes an educated guess. "The Flying Dutchman?" he asks. "Yes," Rob answers, impressed. "In the Netherlands we don't have just one ghost but a ship full of them." Daniel doesn't know what he would do if he had to deal with an entire boat crew of what he saw last night. He is not interested in finding out. "Isn't the Flying Dutchman after being a harbinger of doom?" Daniel asks him. He knows the legend. Any sailor sighting the ghost ship would soon find himself sleeping with the fishes, literally. "Yes, doom, but more than this," Rob explains. If asked, the crew of de Village Hollander will send messages. To who, Daniel asks, then wonders if he is setting a poor example in English grammar. "To the dead, or perhaps to the living, because you may soon be dead," Rob says, smiling. Daniel says, mulling this over. "But surely the crew is being punished, forced to sail forever, never making port. Why would they trouble themselves with the sending of messages? Even the damned need a purpose. Don't you think, Daniel?" Daniel doesn't know what to think. He's not sure how the Flying Dutchman relates to his situation. It is, after all, just a myth. But the story passes the time, two people shortening the road, as his grandfather had said. "Surely," he says, though Daniel is honestly sure of nothing. Feeling unmoored from reality, like the fabled ship set adrift, he is circling an endless course around what happened last night, just as he does around the day of Petra's death. Rob hands him his wooden staff to hold and reaches inside the front of his jacket. After a bit of searching, he pulls out a burnished copper heart a little bigger than the average coat button. "My wife gave this to me before I left for the way. It stays on like this." Rob shows him how the small magnetic back piece holds the metal heart in place on the breast pocket of his shirt. "It is to protect me, my health, my spirit." Daniel hasn't seen a heart like this before, but he has an uncle who swears by his magnetic copper bracelet for his golfer's elbow. It was the kind of jewelry that was supposed to ward off everything from high blood pressure to hemorrhoids. He was not sure where you were supposed to wear it for the latter. Does it work? So he asks Rob. It does not matter if it works, Rob tells him, putting the heart back under his jacket, taking back his walking staff. What matters is my wife believes that it works. And so, I am protected by something I cannot see or understand. Do you think this is any stranger than finding the Virgin in breakfast toast? A little less strange. I agree, Rob says, and they share a smile. In any case, the world is full of curious things, Rob says, adjusting his cap, looking out at the long trail spread out in front of them. As far as they can see, well-ordered rows of plucked vineyards line either side of path. This is the beginning of Rioja country. The fall air here still holds the heady scent of a few wizened grapes left behind on the bare web of vines. Do you see the ghost of your wife, Daniel? It takes him a moment to realize what the Dutchman has just said. No. I mean, I don't believe so, he stammers, not sure of the answer. And then, how were you knowing about my wife? He is fascinated more than suspicious. I sometimes have a way of knowing such things, Rob tells him. Curious things, so Daniel asks. Curious things, Rob confirms. Daniel goes along with this. Maybe Rob had met up with Ginny and she had told him about the ashes. He wants to ask but decides to let it go. After all, he might have given his widow status away himself without knowing it. There are those who are highly astute at reading other people. He can imagine the Dutchman would be one of them, his empathy that well developed. They skirt the sinking rubble of a ruined agricultural outbuilding. The Dutchman reaches down and picks up a small stone piece that has fallen onto the trail. He walks ahead to a cairn set up at the crossroads. The stones are piled next to a display case filled with aged flowers in a dusky vase. Daniel stands a respectful distance away, though he can still see the two dates separated by a dash etched into the glass. Birth and death. We all are having our ghosts, Daniel, Rob says, as he stoops to place the stone at the base of the cairn. The question is not if they exist. He rises and leans into his walking stick with both hands as he turns to address Daniel. It is what message do they bring? The two start back on the rowing path that cuts through an infinite earthen carpet of spent vineyards. When Daniel passes the cairn, he crosses himself without thinking. They stop to eat their lunch in a grassy spot just outside of Los Arcos. Daniel has a huge cheese bocadillo that he bought from a takeaway in the busy market town. The woman behind the counter had used a whole stick of bread to make it, then warmed it in the oven. The grease from the rich, tangy manchego soaks through the paper it is wrapped in. It tastes better than anything he has eaten yet on the Camino, and he savors it slowly. Rob has finished his packed lunch already, a picnic reminiscent of the day Daniel and Ginny had met him at Santa Maria de Unite. He had insisted on sharing his fruit again. Daniel initially protested, then ended up taking an apple anyway. Now the Dutchman lies under a wide-trunked tree, relaxed in the grass. He uses his backpack as a pillow, gazing directly up into the blue of the sky, laughing lightly under his breath. You don't find this funny? He asks Daniel, hands laced beneath his head. Directly across from them is a cemetery with an ironwork entranceway. The arch is inscribed with Spanish words. You understand what this means? Yes, he says, gesturing to the inscription. When Daniel doesn't respond, Rob consults the Google Translator on his phone and reads aloud the English result. You are what I was and will be what I am now. He bursts into fresh laughter as he drops the phone back in the grass. I reckon I'm not in the mood, Daniel says, apologizing. He takes the last bite of his sandwich, resists the urge to lick his fingers. But this is the most depressing thing I have ever heard, Rob says, wiping his eyes, still chuckling. Daniel had heard the Dutch had a peculiar sense of humor. Had watched a subtitled film once from the Netherlands with Petra and hadn't realized the dark story of a family caught in an avalanche was a comedy until she told him afterward. But there is more to his attitude than a lack of appreciation for Rob's black humor. He has made the conscious decision to put last night behind him. He needs to focus on what he's here for. to get serious, or he's going to lose more than his mind. When a slight wind threatens to blow the greasy sandwich paper away, he wraps up his apple core and throws it all in a plastic bag. I think I'll go back to Los Arcos to light a candle, he says, hoping Rob won't take his departure the wrong way. For your wife, Rob asks. The Dutchman doesn't sit up, just lies still with his hands folded across his chest. Yes, Daniel says. Perhaps I'll see you in Torres del Rio. This is where Daniel plans to stop and stay over for the night. Rob hasn't shared his plans. Perhaps you will, Rob says, closing his eyes now like he might take a nap. Goodbye, Daniel, he says. Good luck with your ghosts. SLN, Rob, Daniel says, reaching for his backpack, then putting on his hat. Rob doesn't ask for a translation of the Irish word for goodbye. Some phrases are understood no matter where you hail from. After taking a few steps in the direction of town, he turns around, walking backwards as he speaks. And Rob. You're welcome, the Dutchman says without opening his eyes. The breeze blows a piece of grass into his beard. He leaves it there, content. It is only a couple of minutes to walk back to Los Arcos. Daniel's breaking his own rule about never going back on the Camino, though he doesn't feel too badly about it. It was great walking with the Dutchman, but he needs to be alone with himself for a while. Alone with Petra. He still hasn't found the right spot to spread her ashes. Then again, he's not sure how hard he has been looking. The parish church borders on the main square. As Daniel approaches the entrance, he can see a man in a warm green suit standing outside. A long white beard rests on his chest. Keen eyes betray his age as far younger than one would suspect. A rolled-up backpack sits broken down next to him, hung with the white scallop shell that marks him as a pilgrim. The iron-bound exterior doors of the church are opened wide, but the man's dusty felt hat is upturned on the concrete stoop. It blocks the way in. You can't pass without paying the toll. Daniel has heard about the homeless that walk the Camino. They stay in many of the albergues for free or a modest donativo. Spain's unemployment rate has been shockingly high since the recent downturn. Many people are victims of the country's tanking economy. This man appears to be one of them, walking the long road to Santiago just to put a roof over his head each night. Daniel reaches into his pocket for a few euros but finds nothing but the 20s he got out of the bank machine in Estella. He digs deeper and actually pulls out lint. With embarrassment, he steps over the hat and into the doorway, trying not to look at the man or at his fedora sparsely filled with change. As a result, he smacks his shin on the door jamb and starts off his visit to the Church of Santa Maria with a string of swear words in the vestibule. If the homeless pilgrim is off, but by this he doesn't say so, only stares at the ground, his long, carefully trimmed beard tucked covertly under his chin. Behind it, he is probably laughing his ass off. Once recovered, Daniel stands up from rubbing his shin and starts down a poorly lit hallway leading to the sanctuary. It takes a while for his eyes to adjust, but eventually he is aware of musty woolen tapestries that line the walls on either side. Each one depicts one of the stations of the cross, Christ heavily burdened with a heavy wooden crucifix in most of them. When Daniel reaches the last station, he realizes only 7 of the 14 images are depicted. That means the tapestries are probably pre-17th century. He can't remember why the Catholic Church decided to increase the number of stations of Christ's agony in the last few hundred years. Not enough suffering, he gathers. He exits the corridor into a small narthex with a marble font mounted on the wall. When he dips his fingers in the holy water, he leaves a piece of lint behind in the basin. Fishing it out, he touches his forehead with the furry drops, then steps inside the nave. As is the case with many churches of the Baroque era, the wall behind the altar looks as though lava from a gold volcano has erupted and hardened on every available surface. The overall effect appears cheap to the modern eye, though it surely would not have been. Local nobles made hefty donations to finance both the precious metals and the artwork for a church like this one. This got them not only bragging rights and a good pew, but also a shortened term in purgatory, sometimes even a free pass if the priest was feeling generous. Daniel looks closely and can see some classical as well as Romanesque features in the interior, meaning the church has had several incarnations over its long lifetime. His first work as a civil engineer had been in Italy and France, restoring architectural relics like this one to their former glory, or at least to the point where they wouldn't collapse on the people inside. Petra had been there on a gap year after university, studying religious art. They had met when she couldn't get a payphone to work and he had offered up a coin. Life is such a matter of chance. It feels so long ago. Ancient history, like the Roman columns he can still see hiding inside the open door of the sacristy. Electronic candles light up the altar rail. As he approaches them, he remembers he has no change to put in the metal slot to turn one on for Petra. He wonders briefly if the homeless guy would make change. The fake candles flicker, seemingly to mock him. He sits down in the front pew feeling useless, unable to do anything for the living or the dead with his lack of small change. The artwork of the reredos behind the altar towers above him, its subjects either in abject suffering or blissful adoration depending on their position in the Christ story. A painted wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, her sacred child on her lap, smiles benevolently from her section of the screen. Daniel uses his secondary school Latin to decipher an inscription written underneath the two of them. "I am black, but I am beautiful." Looking back up at the blue-eyed Mary and her pale skin, he figures he must have made a mistake, although a mourner or dark virgin was probably closer to the truth if you looked at the racial makeup of Nazareth at the time of Christ. Daniel had seen a black Madonna once before in Switzerland, but they were rare. White Christianity preferred porcelain-skinned mothers of God and favored Jesuses that looked like West Coast surfer dudes taking a year off college. They painted her white. A voice comes from behind Daniel. He turns around to see a woman sitting in the pew. He hadn't noticed her when he came in, but she must have been there all along. He would have heard her sit down. "The Virgin Mary," she continues when he doesn't respond immediately. "She used to be black, a virgin mourner, but they painted her and the baby white in the 1940s. Daniel turns back to review the small but exquisite statue. He gets up, his mouth held in a tight line. The gold-plated altarpiece looms above him, while the filaments in the fake candles crackle faintly with electricity. He moves into the woman's pew and leans in, whispering fiercely in her ear. It is the question he has wanted to ask ever since he woke up this morning and found her gone. "Where the hell have you been, Ginny?" Passing through the portal de Castillo out of Los Arcos, they are still arguing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she says, not for the first time. "Cop yourself on," Daniel says to her. "You saw someone running across the path same as me." "I did, but it was just someone fooling around. I don't know what the big deal is." Ginny walks and talks quickly, kicking up gravel. "The big deal is that you were ready to shit your cacks." "And so was I," Daniel says. This isn't even an Irish saying. Daniel picked it up when he worked construction one summer in Newcastle-on-Tyne in northeast England. He doesn't usually resort to such grand displays of coarse cultural idiom, but he's upset. "I was just tired," she says, sounding like she still is. "Is that why you were after running?" he asks, taking her elbow, stopping her from walking on. "I was running because you were. You frightened me, Daniel." She adds lightly, "You're sort of frightening me now." Daniel sees his hand holding her arm, becomes aware of the tense set of his jaw, the threat of his body. He feels a hot bloom of shame. He's never been the type of man to be rough with a woman. "Sorry," he says, releasing her. Neither of them says anything. They start walking again. When they pass the cemetery, Rob is long gone. The wind has already erased the flattened grass where he took his catnap. After a few minutes, Ginny breaks the silence. "It was just the wine and the night playing tricks on you." "I know what I saw," Daniel says emphatically, but now he is no longer sure. "Do you want to hear about Torres del Rio?" she tries. They have a Knights Templar church there like the Santa Maria de Unit. It's even smaller, but the original. I don't want another feckin' history lesson. All right, Daniel shouts, stopping on the trail, surprising himself. His anger carries on the wind between them, whistling through her. She closes her eyes as if to absorb the force of it, then opens them, annoyed. Listen, Daniel. I just went on to the next town, like we said. She's trying to talk him down despite her crossness with him, a gift many women seem to possess in abundance in his experience. They should use women more often for hostage negotiation. We did say we were going to Villamé de Montjardin, she says. Didn't we? She waits for him to answer. After a few beats, he does. How can you remember the feckin' names of all those places? I forget them all once I've passed through, except Asquita. It'll take a while for him to forget Asquita. Look, Daniel, I like walking with you. She glances down at her feet and then back up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. No saucy baseball cap today. The light freckles across her nose set to multiply. But I've been walking for a long time without anyone. She hesitates like she wants to say more but doesn't. You shouldn't have gone off on your own like that, he says in a normal voice, more in control now. It wasn't safe. This is the true source of his anger. Had been worried about her. He expects her to be touched by his concern. He couldn't be more wrong. Is that what this is all about? Ginny demands, her own fury starting to loosen. This little woman thing again, unable to protect herself alone on the big bad Camino. Sure, I didn't mean. Because I tell you what, buddy, I am fully capable of walking the way by myself. She leans down and tightens the lace of one hiking boot. Daniel watches as she ties a fierce double knot. I saved for 2 years for this trip, she says, standing up again. Piled up my vacation time, paid someone to take care of my damn cat. She pokes a furious finger in his chest. Daniel has seen his sister in a state like this on occasion. Not usually directed at him, thanks be to God. And then you come along with all this bullshit trying to scare me. She yanks the hiking poles from the side of her backpack, almost breaking the strap. Daniel gets out of her way, afraid he may be on the receiving end of one of the pole's pointy ends. There is no way anybody or anything is going to stand in my way of finishing this, of getting to Santiago, she says, leaning into him, so close he can see the flecks in her hazel eyes. Then she turns and storms off and away from him, her hiking poles flying in front of her in a blur. Or don't be like that, Ginny, Daniel says. Piss off, she calls back over her shoulder. Sure, I didn't mean it like that. She speeds up and around the corner of the next bend in the trail, kicking up dust behind her. It mustn't have rained here like it did when I came out of the Pyrenees, he thinks. The ground here is bone dry. He realizes that they have walked straight through into a different climate zone. This is what Daniel thinks about as he watches her leave him, the weather and the trail, rather than wishing she wouldn't go. They are all gathered around a table at the local hotel in Torres del Rio, a Spaniard, 2 Austrians, some Americans, and Daniel. There's a young pretty French girl, too. Daniel had thought she was from France, but it turns out she is Quacois. For a country with a population less than the state of California, those Canadians were bloody everywhere. The wine flows freely, but Daniel stops at 1 glass. He learned from that fountain. The others are already getting loud and animated with the Vino Tinto, a delectable red wine you can buy in this region for less than the price of water. None of them are staying at the hotel, including him. They all have bunk beds at the albergue across the street, where they paid for the supper at the hotel restaurant when they checked in. Each has a pilgrim dinner voucher for a meal that will probably consist of an overdone piece of pork and a smattering of soggy French fries. Coming from a race of people that lived through their share of famines, Daniel doesn't care much what is served, as long as there are potatoes. The French girl gently touches his forearm with long tapered fingers, leaning in close to say something. She smells earthy and warm, a faint hint of smoke in her hair. He makes sparse conversation, although later he will not remember about what. Looking out the broad window at the front of the restaurant, he watches the late-day pilgrims trudge up the brick-paved road where the Camino runs outside the door of the hotel. The light is fading, and the pilgrims appear like sepia versions of themselves, walking with heavy steps up the incline. He is watching for Ginny, focusing his eyes across the room into the increasing dark as each tired shape moves past the window. He looks for her baseball cap or the distinctive gait of her walk. He scans for a silhouette that matches what he knows of her, soft curves blending with hard lines of muscled determination. He keeps having to apologize to the French girl, asking her to repeat what she is saying. It is not the first time. The Spaniard across from him reaches across the table for his attention. "And you, my friend, will you go to Finisterre?" he asks, his large square teeth bared broadly. The French girl drops her hand from his arm and grins in return. Daniel has never seen people smile as much as on the Camino. "Finisterre?" Daniel asks. He has missed this conversation as well. They are going to start thinking he is partially deaf. "It's on the coast, I understand." Daniel has heard of the Spanish beach town. The name means end of the world. It is only a 3-day walk from Santiago.